Thank you so much, Pastor Springer. We've been communicating about this for a little bit of time, and I told him I really appreciate his attention to detail in scheduling this. Sometimes I show up at churches and I'm really not sure what I'm walking into. They haven't got a lot of communication with the pastor, but he is good about that, and I've appreciated that. I know our ministry is unique, and you are in a good position to hear about it twice, both in Sunday school and in the morning service, which might help you kind of get your brain wrapped around it because it is unique. Some pastors get a little bit nervous about having our ministry in, but I think it's just a bit of a misunderstanding about what we do. We don't work on campaigns. We don't partner with politicians or certainly give money to politicians to help them get elected or anything like that. It is true. And I think this is from the corporate world. They say if you know 5% more than whoever you're talking to, then you're an expert, right? I probably know 5% more than the average person on those types of things, but that's not really what our ministry is about. But I like to describe it with 3 M's, okay? Use the letter M 3 times. That way it's a little bit easier to remember. The first M is motivating. That's just the educational arm, the preaching arm. We are a source of information for people. And by the way, that does include voter guides and other nonpartisan voter information. Our website will have scorecards to look up elected officials and where they're at on things, how they voted on things. But not only that, here's information for where, how you can look up where you vote, who represents you. But also books and materials that are on our back table. We have a book back there that if I get a chance I'll mention, but Amazon won't sell this book, right? A couple of other books back there on America's Christian heritage is kind of geared towards children. Very popular with people, but where they get that information. I will often say to people, do you have a reliable source where you feel like you can go to get accurate, truthful information from a Christian perspective about what's happening at the Georgia General Assembly? And almost no one ever raises their hand when I ask that, unless they're signed up to our mailing list, and I feel good about that. But we do try to just inform and educate people. We several weeks in a row now. I think this is 6 weeks in a row where I've been at a church on Sunday doing what I'm doing here, just helping inform and educate and kind of motivate Christians to be a little bit more informed and active citizens. The second M is, and by the way, we also do a pastor's day at the Capitol, student legislative days at the Capitol for high school juniors and seniors, an annual conference that I'll talk about here in a little bit that's coming up August 22nd, just right over in McDonough, so not too far from you. But we do all that under our educational arm. The second M is what a lot of people think of when they think of our ministry, and that is monitoring. So we're at the Georgia General Assembly when they're in session, and we're monitoring legislation, specifically for religious freedom issues, moral issues, and moral issues would include things like pushing back on the expansion of state-sponsored gambling, pro-life issues, moral issues. And then the third area is Christian education. So Christian homeschooling, Christian schools, which by and large is actually could be under number 1, religious freedom. Right. But, some school choice issues and those types of things. And we do that on the federal level as well. We'll go to Washington, D.C. 2 or 3 times a year, meet with the Georgia people up there on these same issues. Honestly, even though most people think more about the national stuff and pay more attention to the national level, it's much, much harder to make an impact there for any of you or me. Things just happen much more slowly, much more gridlock, right? What have they been doing the last couple of years other than naming bridges and post offices and, other things that they could do to help them get reelected, but it's much more difficult there to get things done and changed. But we do make the effort. But on the state level, we're speaking in committee meetings. We're interacting one-on-one with the legislators. Many of these state legislators, we have their cell numbers, or we can text them and communicate with them. But, we're basically trying to be your representative. We're representing churches in the state of Georgia, primarily. 99% it's independent Baptist churches. We don't turn away any other church that asks for our help or whatever. I've spoken in a handful of Southern Baptist churches, Bible church. That's about the extent that I go to. It's interesting because this is just kind of an aside. Okay, this is free. This isn't going to cost you anything. I'm just going to throw this in. I have talked to pastors from other denominations, if you will. I hate to use the word charismatic, but from more that realm, and they have their own network that they trust, and people who they, independent Baptists are kind of, almost maligned for being, us four no more. But, the old joke about independent Baptists get to heaven and are surprised that there are other people there. I have found the other denominations, the Southern Baptists and they're the same way. And if you're not from their kind of circle, then they're, not really sure. But look, we've had pastors that are not independent Baptists come to our Pastors' Day or other events. That's fine. We're happy to help. Our board members Baptists, and that's, it's what I am. It's what I've always been since I've been saved. But anyway, that was a bit of a rabbit trail. That's all under M, which, by the way, I said when the Georgia General Assembly is in session. Does anybody know how many days in a calendar year, typical year, the Georgia General Assembly is officially in session? Anybody? This proves the value of our ministry, right? Okay, how about this? How about you take a guess? Eliza, I'm going to pick on you and make you guess a number of days. You shouldn't have told me your name. Now I could call on you from a pulpit. Did he cheat? Did you help him? 40 days. That's very good. Was that really just a stab, or did you have one of you have some idea that it was? You're just totally guessing. Okay. Yeah, it's the first 3 months of the year. So they take, 90 days to do those 40 days. And sometimes they're there having committee meetings or other things, but it's not an official day where they actually, gavel in, as we call it. But 40 days. Now some people make a face when I say that, but I'm grateful for that. The more they're down there, the more mischief they get into. And so I have no problem with that. And they get paid. You want anybody, Hal? Isn't it Hal with the pink shirt? How much do you think the state legislators get paid? Round number. Less than 20. Oh, wait. No, they got a raise. It's just over 20,000 a year. Now the U.S. guys get like 175 or something like that. But yeah, it's a part-time job, really, and that's although they are doing other things the rest of the year, it's a 3-month out of the year position, and so it's actually tricky to be a citizen legislator. A lot of them, are business owners or lawyers or, rely on their spouse for their primary income. But, it can be really tricky. My representative for about 10 years was a guy who he would have to, he'd get done at the Capitol. He'd be like, I'm sorry, Paul, I got to go. I got to get to work. And he'd have to get to his real job in the afternoon, and that made it very challenging. He finally just, after about 10 years, just stepped down. It was very challenging to do, which the average term that they stay there is either 6 or 8. So people talk about term limits, but they're mostly term limited themselves just because of how challenging it is to serve as a state legislator. Anyway, this I'm back to number one, right? The educational part, but I'm talking about the second M, which is monitoring. Let me mention the third M, ministering to those in the Capitol community. We want to be salt and light in the Capitol community. We want to be a gospel witness, not just to the legislators, but their staff or other lobbyists who are down there. And we appreciate your prayers as we attempt to do that, both on the state and federal level. I do have on the back table a prayer card. Let me mention that quickly, and then I'll get into my PowerPoint. My prayer card for me and Corey Lawrence, who's our associate director, he's only part-time. He works full-time at a Christian school, but they're real flexible with him getting away and helping, especially during the legislative session. But it looks like this. It's designed for you to tear off the top part, so you can take that home and pray for us like a typical missionary prayer card, and fill out the bottom part with your contact information, including email address, so that you can get our information and keep up with what's happening at the General Assembly and know how to pray for our ministry. Do me a favor, fill that out legibly. I get home and often can't read the email addresses that are written down there. They all have creative characters and different things. It's like, what is that? What is that? An L or a 1 or a, what is that? Dash, an underline. Just help me out there, and make sure I know whether it's a 6 or a G on there. Okay, but you can leave that on the back table when we're done. So I want to give kind of a ministry update, ministry report, and then a legislative report. And so this will take a few minutes, but let me go through the first part kind of quickly, since we've talked about a few things. This is our recent Topgolf fundraiser, or someone won a Yeti cooler. How about that? And your pastor was there. This is partly why I popped that up here, but I don't think we're going to be doing that anymore, Pastor Spring. Our board kind of said, let's move on from that. It's a lot of work for not a lot of fundraising, but it was a good event and fun. This is one of our student legislative days for high school juniors and seniors at the Capitol. You may notice the governor and Mrs. Kemp, who got a picture with the students, were kind enough to work that out. That's my current legislator. He's the one that took the spot of the one I just talked about that finally stepped down. But that's the smaller group of students. We had two student legislative days, and this is the smaller of the two. It's one of the legislators there speaking to the students, and that's me speaking to them, going over biblical worldview, and kind of what I tell the educators is they'll see in practice what they learned in the classroom. And when it comes to civics and government, it can be quite a bit different, what we learn in theory versus what's actually in practice. This is our Pastors and Ministry Leaders Day, and we had a great event there. I don't know if you all know Jim Shetler, but he spoke at our event. And we also had someone speak. We had legislators, of course. We also had someone from the Israeli Defense Forces, or at least former member of the Israeli Defense Forces, give us an update on the war in Israel, and that was very interesting. And this was this was the best attended Pastors and Ministry Leaders Day we have had. 175 or so. And typically, Governor Kemp speaks at this event every year. This year, he was confirmed to speak. And then you may remember about that time in February, a state trooper was killed. He was investigating an accident, and he was hit. And the funeral was the morning of our pastor's day. So the governor's office called me, I don't know, the day before, 2 days before, and said he's going to the funeral. And I said, look, I appreciate him making our first responders a priority, and we totally understood that. And when he came out for the picture with the students, he said, hey, I'm really sorry I missed your pastor's day. People sometimes will ask me, well, does the governor know you? And I'm like, I think so. I mean, whenever he sees me, he seems like he remembers me. But when you're a group that can get 175 people to the Capitol, the governor and everyone else is going to pay attention. And that's just a reality, because they know any group that can get 100, 150 people down there to the Capitol is a significant group. Because for everyone who made the trip to Atlanta, there has to be, 7, 8, 10 more that didn't make the trip that you represent. And then when they know, oh, wait a minute, these are pastors and ministry leaders, that means all of them represent a group of people. And that's how we have influence. We, as I said, we don't give money to campaigns or things like that. That's typically how lobbyists get influence. But you either have to have money or you have to have numbers. And so that's what helps us is pastors coming down that day for that. This is our annual conference from last year. It's a couple of state legislators that we did a legislators panel with. This is always one of the more popular things on our annual conference, where legislators actually take questions from the audience and people hear from them. And I've had pastors say to me, I think of myself as fighting this culture war, but that's nothing compared to what these guys are doing. I mean, they're really on the front lines. I mean, one shared a few years ago how because this state House member voted for the heartbeat bill, his fiance broke off their engagement. So, I mean, sometimes they're really paying the price for doing what's right down there. And, politicians are maybe one of the most maligned people in America, right? And sometimes that's well earned. In my case, just so you know, the Lord has given me a heart to reach them and to disciple them and to work with them. So I'm not the best person to come up to and say, all politicians are like the guy did last Sunday at the church I was at. They're all crooks. They're all this. Some of them are godly people who have influenced me spiritually because they're godly and want to honor the Lord with what they do. But anyway, this is from our annual conference a couple years ago when the governor spoke at that conference as well. But so that's coming up August 22nd. I have some flyers on the back table back there that you can pick up about that. This is open to anybody to attend. It's $55, which includes the VIP banquet, and it's an afternoon and evening. So it's on a Thursday, which here's another aside here. I've agonized about doing it on a Saturday versus a Thursday. Two things. I know that it would be harder for pastors to come on a Saturday than it would, during the week. They're often very busy with other things on Saturday. But I also recognize that even though most people may have Saturdays off, it's not like they're sitting around looking for something to do on Saturday, right? People are doing, ball games and all the other stuff. So we continue to do it on a work day, weekday, Thursday afternoon and evening. All right, so now let's get into the actual legislative recap from this last legislative session. Let's begin on the national level, because this was in the news earlier this year, and there was a lot of, excitement about it in a negative way. But the U.S. House, not the Senate, didn't get signed into law. One chamber voted to expand the definition of anti-Semitism. It was a reaction to the anti-war protests that we're seeing on college campuses, and it was similar to Trump's executive order when he was president, so it didn't have to go through the House and Senate, but it kind of used the definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Association that was written into the Title VI Anti-Discrimination Code. But the people, when the House did this, there were people who, always looking for clicks, always looking for, fundraising opportunities. It said, this is going to make the New Testament illegal, because if any preacher gets up and preaches that the Jews killed Jesus or anything negative about the Jews, that they're going to be, charged with anti-Semitism, hate crime. I don't believe that at all. But that's what some people were saying when the House passed this. But it was just similar to what Trump did, and it's similar to what Governor Kemp signed into Georgia law earlier this year. Essentially the same thing. So we already have it as law here in Georgia. Candidly, I was one of the people that the sponsor of the bill approached and said, we'd like to get Citizen Impact to support this, endorse this, maybe sign on to a letter. And I didn't do it because I had some concerns that we're just not fans of hate crimes legislation, right, which is really thought crimes legislation, and speech crime, and it's a challenging and difficult issue. I recognize that if someone spray paints a swastika on the side of a synagogue, I'd like to see them charged with something more than just a graffiti misdemeanor, right? That does seem to be more behind that, right? Although I said that in church one time, and a guy came up to me afterwards and wanted to argue with me about that's just free speech. Well, I don't think so. But on the same vein, we just get more and more where, how do you decide who gets that special protection? The government is picking winners and losers, right? So you're a part of a special protected group, so crime was committed against you, we can also charge them with a hate crime, but, oh, sorry, that crime against you, can't. And literally, when the federal government under the Obama administration expanded hate crimes, in committee, the Republicans tried to amend it to include hate crimes, would include veterans and would include the elderly. And the Democrats voted that down so that the hate crimes only applied to, LGBT and groups that donate, if I'm being honest, donate to them, right? So it doesn't seem sincere, but there has been a lot of anti-Semitism, and just to clarify what that is, not just a religion, not just a ethnicity, but it's a unique combination of the two. I didn't oppose it either. All right, Title IX, you may have heard about that. The Biden administration, Title IX came out 50 years ago to try to give equality to women in academic settings, sports, and things like that. A lot of debate about good or bad, You'll often hear whenever you see women's sports doing well, see, this all goes back to Title IX. But it eliminated a lot of men's sports to try to, the Olympics did that. Did you know that? The first time the Olympics have equal number of men's and women's sports, which meant eliminating men's sports, right? So is it a good thing? I don't know. But what this is a terrible thing, because it essentially says if you just call yourself a woman, then you get these protections. So men who, quote unquote, identify as a woman would get these protections, essentially erasing the protection for women, rewrites the civil rights legislation to advance the LGBT agenda by federal fiat. So this didn't go through the House and Senate, just Biden administration decided to do that. And also waters down the legal standards for those accused falsely of sexual harassment. So college campuses and things like that. That's been a real problem where, girls are making accusations and the young men are not getting due process. They're just, well, she said it, so you're guilty. And so this waters that down even more. But it does only apply to schools receiving federal funding. So a typical Christian school who does not receive federal funding would not have to apply this. But it's still very problematic, to the point where a judge has stopped this from being implemented. It was supposed to be implemented August 1st, but it's not, because it's going through the court system and challenging the legality of that. Okay, so on the state level, we had sports betting. They tried to do this through a constitutional amendment, expanding state-sponsored gambling. We already have state-sponsored gambling in Georgia. What do we have now? The lottery, right. And so they tried to, expand to sports betting, which is primarily done on the phone through apps. So to put it under the lottery and not make it a constitutional amendment. But even some people who support gambling said, no, that's not going to work. That's just going to get challenged, because we just need to do it, quote unquote, the right way, and do it through a constitutional amendment, which is much harder to get done because it requires 2/3 vote in the House, 2/3 vote in the Senate, and then goes to the voters of Georgia to make the final decision on the November ballot. Now, you might have seen a question about gambling on your May primary ballot, but that was just a question. That was not deciding anything. But interestingly enough, it was worded in a way that most people voted yes, even people who were against gambling. Now, I sent out a video about that, and I explained, look, please don't vote yes. That's just telling them that you want to expand gambling. It was worded as, should the people decide or should the politicians in Atlanta decide? Well, everybody's like, oh, well, the people should decide. Well, that means a constitutional amendment and getting more gambling. So you can imagine, even if they do this through a constitutional amendment, that it'll be worded in such a way that it'll confuse a lot of people, and hundreds of millions of dollars will be spent to try to get people to vote for that. So we don't want it to go to a constitutional amendment. We want to fight it in the House and Senate level. It did pass the Senate, but did not pass the House this year. And this is I think the 12th legislative session where we have fought some form of expansion of state-sponsored gambling. Casinos, horse racing, and when the Supreme Court changed the laws on sports betting in 2018, now sports betting, which is maybe the most addictive of all the forms of gambling. So, yeah, I mentioned the Republican ballot question. The Georgia Promise Scholarship Act was signed into law this year. We served on the kind of ad hoc group of school choice groups that worked on passage of this bill. But what we did, and let me explain it here, $6,500 in state funds is deposited into a scholarship account for homeschooling, Christian school, private school, educational needs, usually tuition. Students that qualify for this must reside in a district that's one of the bottom 25% of public schools. So they're rated D or F by the Department of Education. But it does include students starting kindergarten. So if a public school student is in one of those schools, he or she can transfer out, and $6,500 would follow of state money, not federal money, not property tax money. All of those are part of the funding public education. And the city of Atlanta even kicks in more money. I heard that per student, a city of Atlanta school student, it's about $20,000 a student, right? But about $6,500 of that is state money, and that's what would follow the student to a private school, a Christian school. Now, what we did is we made very sure that Christian schools would be protected if they decided, they don't have to, but if they decided to participate in this. And we actually offered stronger religious freedom protection language that would more strongly protect Christian schools, and that got adopted into the bill. And so if Christian schools decide to participate in this, they have a little bit stronger protection. And I always try to explain this. In talking to the House and the Senate members, I say, look, you can't discriminate and keep Christian schools from being able to participate in this. You got to protect them. You can't tell them they can't teach the Bible. You can't tell them who they hire or fire or what they have to teach. Right? I do all that and fight for them. But then I look at Christian schools and say, but you better be careful taking this money. I mean, it is public money. And as much as we are down there to try to protect your school, one change in administration, one change in governor, and all those regulations could change. And if you're dependent on this money, then you're faced with a very difficult decision when they start telling you what you can teach, what you can't teach, who you can hire, et cetera, et cetera. Does that make sense? I always feel like people may be a little bit confused about that we're double-minded, but we're not. We're just trying to look at both sides of it. Since y'all don't have a Christian school here, let's skip forward on this and let's talk about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. This is something that ended up being needed and necessary back in the 90s. And there was the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was signed into law in 1993. But the Supreme Court ruled on that in 97 and said it only provides protection from the federal government, not states. So I think it's up to 23 states. I need to update my slide. 23 states have enacted a state-level RFRA and another 10 states through judicial action. But here's what it does. How many of you hate when preachers ask you to raise your hand? No, I'm kidding. How many of you have heard? I'm not going to ask you to explain it. I'm not going to ask you to. But you've heard RFRA. You've heard Religious Freedom Restoration Act. One, maybe two, three. Anyone else while we're slowly raising your hands? There's a lot of confusion about this, even by people who support religious freedom. They think that people can just say, well, it's against my religion, so I don't have to obey that law. But that's not the way this works. But we already have it on the federal level. So the federal government took action that infringed upon religious freedom. That individual would get to have his day in court. Now, we don't have that protection here in Georgia if the state or a local municipality or county did something. We couldn't challenge them either way. But here's a better example of how it does work. Florida, where they do have it. In fact, all the states that touch Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, all have a RIF, where Georgia does not. But in Florida, the city of Tampa passed an ordinance that said, I guess they were having problems with a particular park or something, a lot of littering or other things from homeless people. So they said, no more feeding them outdoors. You gotta go indoors to, we want to use the phrase, I want to use the phrase soup kitchen. I don't know if that's still politically correct or not, but you know what I'm saying. Not outdoors. Stop doing it outdoors. But there was a pastor down there who he'd always done that. And he believed that's what God wanted him to do. He believed that he was serving Jesus by bringing them food, and so he continued to do it in violation of this law. Found himself in a court of law, standing before a judge in violation of it. And in his defense, used the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that Florida has, and he won. The judge said, even though the law they never thought about religious freedom when they passed it. All they were thinking about is keeping his park clean. But the judge said, yeah, but it does affect this man's religious freedom. And so he threw the law out. Didn't automatically win, but he got his day in court. That makes sense? I'm going to have a Q&A here in a second, but hopefully that makes sense. And if it doesn't, we can try to clarify that. But we've been trying to get that done in Georgia for some time. It did pass the Senate this year, but never even got a hearing in the House. And I'm sorry that this is off just a little bit, but I don't know if you can. I only have a couple more slides left, but maybe we can do that. Parents and Children Protection Act, this said that this would prohibit certain actions by adults, like teachers, to prohibit them from discussing, transgender issues and other issues without the parents' knowledge, like behind the parents' back. Have you heard of this happening in other states? In fact, opponents from the LGBT activists called it the Don't Say Gay bill. Right? But it doesn't say anything like that, but they're mocking it by saying teachers can't say the word gay. No, what they can't do is indoctrinate your children behind the parents' back, right? Well, the senator here in Georgia, well-intentioned, decided he's going to introduce a bill that does that, but he included private schools. And I went to the senator and I said, Senator, I agree with what you're trying to do, but you can't include Christian schools. Because this would, even though I agree with what you're trying to do, this would give the government control over what Christian schools can and can't teach. And by the way, I probably don't have to convince you of this, but often this kind of control comes through things that are well-intentioned. Right? Well, we won't fight that because, we agree with that. No, but soon as the government's foot is in the door of telling schools what they can teach, then who knows what will happen next. He's like, I can't make an exception. I'm like, y'all make exceptions all the time and do things that just apply to public schools and leave private schools out of it. And I learned that he had private school parents of these elitist private schools that, pay $50,000 a year for their kids to go there, who's, were getting this indoctrination from these schools, and they wanted to leave their children there at this elitist school and not pull them out. Whereas I'm like, look, it's a private school. You put your kids somewhere else. So he was insistent to the point where he was okay amending it so that it didn't apply to public schools, that it only applied to private schools. So he had those on the political right opposing it, but he also had those from the political left, the LGBT, opposing it. So he literally did what very few legislators are able to do, introduce a bill where everyone's against it. So it didn't go very far, but we'll keep an eye on that. But what can you do? Well, first of all, pray. Pray for our ministry. Pray for those in authority. Pray for our upcoming election, and pray for God's will to be done, and vote. I mean, we're not here to endorse candidates, things like that, but we would encourage you to be registered to vote. And if you have not voted in a while, I would encourage you to look up your voter registration. If you've moved, I would encourage you to double check your voter registration. Often people, when they change their driver's license, go ahead and change your voter registration, but it wouldn't hurt to check that. This is the website where you can do that. The My Voter page of the Secretary of State's website, the Georgia Secretary of State's website. That's they take out their phones and take a picture of that preacher, or do you want to maybe just give it to them later? But I can leave that up there a minute. But that's how you can check your voter registration. That's where you can check where you vote. That's where you can check dates for when early voting starts. That's where you can get a sample ballot to see ahead of time what you're going to be voting on and who you're going to be voting on. So I would encourage you to be prepared for this upcoming election. You have to have all this prepared, all this correct, a month before the November election, okay? So if you're not registered, or if you need to change it, I need to do that. Just plan to do it by October 1st. It might be 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, something like that, but plan to do that by October 1st.